All right, everyone, we're going to get started. I know some people will continue to trickle in, but I appreciate everybody's time, so we want to be prompt. My name is Eddie Edwards. I'm a partner at Dinsmore and Scholl. I practice in our corporate practice group. We call it BASS here, with a little bit of expertise in the sports world. And we're incredibly excited to host this webinar titled Wild West, From Wild West to Regulated Roadmap, NIL's Legal Turning Point post July 1st. We've been fortunate to be able to assist in various aspects of the name, image, and likeness space. And we're incredibly excited to put together a panel of individuals who are very active in this space. So before I move forward, though, I want to make sure, in case we run short on time, I want to thank Autumn Mann, Kristen Howard, and Nick Wagner from Dinsmore and Scholl, who really helped us put this together. Thank you for all of your efforts. We appreciate the advertising, the marketing, the advice, and all that good stuff. Again, we're incredibly fortunate to have a panel that truly represents the multifaceted landscape of college athletics in this new era. On one side, we have Jason, Doug, and Jake, gentlemen whose professional lives are almost singularly dedicated to the intricate world of name, image, and likeness, player evaluation, talent assessment, and the complex financial engineering that now underpins so much of collegiate sports. Their expertise is deep, specialized, and they are indeed helping to shape the very foundation of this evolving industry. They're in the trenches, developing the models, negotiating the deals, and advising on the most granular levels of NIL and revenue share. And then bring a crucial and complementary perspective. We have an athletic director, Chris King, who is a Division I mid-major director of athletics. And while NIL is undeniably a top-tier priority, it is one critical place within a vast demanding portfolio. AD's days aren't just about NIL contracts. They're about balancing entire athletic budgets, ensuring academic success across 24 sports, driving philanthropic efforts, building state-of-the-art facilities, and fostering a culture of holistic student-athlete development. They're implementing these groundbreaking changes on the ground, integrating them into the existing framework of an entire athletic department, and constantly asking, how does this impact our mission, our athletes, and our institution as a whole? Our panel offers a unique blend, the unparalleled depth of those immersed in the daily mechanics of NIL and revenue share, coupled with the vital breadth of an athletic leader navigating these changes within the comprehensive operational realities of a Division I program. We hope that this combination will lead to a truly rich and comprehensive discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists. Again, thank you all for your time. First, Jason Belzer. Jason is the founder of Student Athlete NIL, an agency of record that specializes in assisting brands, universities, and student athletes navigate the new era of name, image, and likeness. Student Athlete NIL manages more than 50 NIL collectives at universities across the country and has negotiated over $75 million in NIL deals. The agency also hosts the annual NIL Summit at the College Football Hall of Fame in Atlanta. Jason is also founder and president of Game Inc., an agency that specializes in the career management and marketing of coaches and the creation of collegiate sporting events. The firm has negotiated more than $100 million in contracts to date. He is also co-founder of Athlete Director U, a transformative digital media and professional development platform for college athletic administrators and coaches. ADU is the #1 consumed original content publication in the college sports industry. Jason graduated from Rutgers University, earning degrees in sports management and political science. He went on to receive his MBA from the University of Illinois and a JD from Rutgers University School of Law, and is a licensed attorney in New York and New Jersey. Thank you, Jason. Chris King. Chris, why don't you wave so if everybody can see? I know there's multiple screens there. Chris serves as the Vice President and Director of Athletics at Robert Morris University. Chris is a highly accomplished Director of Athletics with 28 years of progressive Division I leadership experience, including 17 consecutive years as Division I Athletic Director. He is a 2-time recipient of the prestigious NACDA Athletics Director of the Year Award in 2022-23 and 2017-18, underscoring his sustained excellence and impact in the field. Chris has a proven track record of fostering competitive success, leading RMU to 8 conference regular season championships and 12 NCAA postseason appearances since 2019. The Robert Morris University Department of Athletics achieved unprecedented success in the 2024-25 fiscal and academic year, setting new records in competitive performance and departmental growth. Chris is also recognized as a recognized thought leader in collegiate athletics, serving on the NACDA FCS Executive Committee and the NCAA Football Championship Committee. He's a regular panelist and mentor for top coaching consortiums like the NABC and Top Connect, and has authored publications on crisis management and leadership, positioning him as a key voice in navigating the future of college sports, including NIL and the transfer portal. Next, we have Jake Rosenberg. He's the founder of the Athlete Group, a sports consulting firm he established in the spring of 2024 after spending the prior 12 and a half years with the Philadelphia Eagles, most recently as the VP of Football Administration. In Philadelphia, Jake worked directly with Executive Vice President General Manager Howie Roseman on developing and implementing the Eagles plan for player signings and acquisitions. He also played a key role in all aspects of salary cap management, contract negotiations, compliance with the NFL CBA, and strategic planning. He was the Eagles' primary contact point with agents and has done deals with and has relationships with the vast majority of those who represent players. The Athlete Group has primarily worked with university athletic programs and their revenue-generating sports and staff to professionalize structures and processes, building better teams. Since its inception, the Athlete Group has counted 6 Power 4 schools as clients. In addition to the consulting and advisory work, the Athlete Group has led multiple high-level hiring searches in college sports and is focusing on greater attention and resources in that area. Next, we have Doug Whaley. Doug is an entrepreneur, business owner, and senior vice president of player personnel for the UFL. Prior to the merger of the XFL and UFL, Doug served as a senior vice president of the XFL, leading the organization's personnel department as it was rebuilding its brand in professional sports. Doug is no stranger to building in professional sports leagues, as he has worked in several front office roles for the NFL clubs, including serving as the general manager for the Buffalo Bills. His experience from the scouting department to the front office has helped Doug develop a first-class reputation in the industry in both talent evaluation and building out a front office. Along with his role in the UFL, Doug is currently consulting with university collectives and helping them strategize and build out their NIL business structure, particularly Alliance 412 here in Pittsburgh. So to our 4 panelists, thank you for your participation. I've dealt with all of you guys in one way or another throughout my career, and I'm just very thankful that you made yourselves available for this webinar. And without further ado, I want to introduce my partner, Nick Godfrey.
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you to all of you out there for joining us today. As Eddie said, my name is Nick Godfrey. I am a partner at Dinsmore and Scholl in our litigation department here in Pittsburgh. And in addition to my litigation practice, I've spent the last 15 years representing athletic directors, coaches, athletic personnel, and student athletes in enforcement and infractions matters before the NCAA, including in multiple hearings before the NCAA Division I Committee on Infractions. And I want to start today by spending a little bit of time talking about the history of NIL and how we got here today. So, as most of you know, NIL stands for name, image, and likeness. And in the world of college athletics, it generally relates to the ability of student athletes to profit off of their own name, image, and likeness. Now, over the last 15 years, there's been a gradual breakdown in the rules prohibiting student athletes from not only profiting off of their name, image, and likeness, but also from receiving compensation beyond traditional athletic scholarships. In 2014, you had the decision in the O'Bannon case involving former UCLA basketball player Ed O'Bannon, where Judge Claudia Wilkin from the Northern District of California ruled that NCAA member institutions should be allowed to offer full cost of attendance to student athletes to cover cost of living expenses. More recently, you had the Alston case, which was also initially decided by Judge Wilkin and then ultimately affirmed by the United States Supreme Court. There, the courts enjoined the NCAA from enforcing rules limiting the education-related benefits that member institutions may make available to student athletes. Now, in the immediate aftermath of Alston, the NCAA announced that it would no longer enforce the rules restricting the ability of student athletes to profit off of their NIL. That did not end the issues, as most of you know. A number of states enacted laws attempting to restrict the ability of member institutions to enforce NIL rules. The NCAA itself struggled with enforcing its new NIL rules, and in particular, in distinguishing between NIL deals intended to compensate student athletes for the use of their name, image, and likeness versus deals intended to compensate student athletes for athletic performance or initial or continued enrollment at member institutions. That ultimately led to more lawsuits, 3 of which resulted in what has become known as the House settlement, and that's where we're going to start today. So the House settlement, which just went into effect on July 1st, now allows member institutions to directly compensate student athletes for the use of their NIL through a revenue sharing model, which also establishes a cap on the revenue that can be shared with student athletes. That cap is going to start at $20.5 million, beginning with the 25-26 academic year, and is likely to increase over the next several years. At the same time, the House settlement allows student athletes to continue to sign NIL deals with third parties, but it's going to permit the NCAA to enforce rules to prevent its member institutions from using those third-party NIL deals to circumvent the cap. It's going to establish what has become known as an NIL clearinghouse, known as NIL Go, which is going to be overseen by Deloitte. And the clearinghouse is going to be responsible for evaluating those third-party deals to make sure that they are for, quote, a valid business purpose at, quote, fair market value. And so with that introduction, I'm going to direct my first question to Jason and ask him to talk about the challenges that member institutions are going to face with the clearinghouse from both the revenue sharing model and from the perspective of third-party NIL deals.
For sure. Thank you, guys, and thank you for having me today. So I think we'll start off with the challenge that was created 4 years ago when NIL began, and that is that while there is quote-unquote cooperation amongst institutions at the NCAA level, there's also a lot of competition. And so that is essentially what created the concept of the collective and what it allowed it to proliferate, is every school said, hey, we need a mechanism to be able to pay our student athletes. And it was actually pretty easy because they didn't have to do it themselves. They were able to go out and outsource it to organizations like NIL, Blueprint, or stand up their own third-party NIL collectives. Now that there are rules and regulations, it's going to be very difficult for these schools to wean themselves off of the past. And the reality is that while many institutions will say a school like Robert Morris is not spending anywhere near the $20.5 million cap. And so the majority of Division I schools outside of the Power Four are nowhere near that limit. But the ones in the Power Four are spending $20.5 million. And the reality is that Ohio State probably spent more on football last year on that number than anyone else. So it's going to be really hard to get Ohio State, Big Ten, SEC, all of these institutions to be able to say, well, we are going to live within this artificial limitation. The reality is that by 2032, the media rights deal in the SEC and the Big Ten is going to be over $100 million a year per school. And it's going to be more than double what the ACC and Big 12 have. So when you think about that, it's almost like going to the Yankees right now and saying, hey, Yankees, for the last 100 years, you could spend whatever you want on your payroll. But now we're going to make it so that, the Royals and the Athletics can spend just as much as you guys, and we have to stop. So all of these institutions are trying to look for mechanisms to get around this process. At the moment, they're playing nice. And what we saw, interestingly enough, last week or 2 weeks ago now, was the CSC, the commission came out and said, hey, we're going to essentially try to quash or limit the ability for collectives to operate by saying that their work is a non-business purpose, right? It's an actually, student athlete working for a collective isn't actually working in the true sense of NIL. Obviously, as somebody that built a big business around that, I disagree. And they were facing the potential of a lawsuit by more than 70 collectives if they didn't backtrack off of that. So essentially, in literally the first 3 weeks of this cap, we now have a soft cap. We went from a hard cap to now a soft cap. And so we are just in another arms race at this point to figure out how we can get around that process.
Jason, I want to just add a quick follow-up, and you mentioned Ohio State, and I think it's important for the audience to understand how certain universities and colleges kind of circumvented it already for this upcoming 25-26 year, right? So, and I was involved in some of these, and Doug, I know you may have been, and Jake and Chris, and prior to July 1, right, you could pay your student athletes without being under the guise of the House settlement, right? So a lot of student athletes were entering into collective deals with that third party collective, right, from a certain date in the spring, and it expired June 30th. Yep. And all funds were paid within that period of time. And there was somewhat of an imbalance in what they got there versus what they would receive post July 1. That's right. And depending on the specific institution, you could execute 2 agreements, right? One until June 30th and one post July 1 that could be assigned. Or what we're seeing now is the member institutions are, issuing their own rev share agreements, right? So the ones that the student athletes executed with the collective, it's not being assigned. Have you seen any pushback with that with regard to the student athletes with, the member institutions? Because the language is significantly, in my opinion, more restrictive, right, with the student athlete.
Yep. Yeah, it was arguably one of the dumbest collective decisions that I've ever seen made in business, which is let's go take all the money that's sitting in the bank accounts of all these collectives, and because technically there's a cap that's coming into place on July 1st, we're going to empty our accounts. We're going to sign our student athletes to new deals with the collective. And then once July 1st happens, we're going to turn around and put these student athletes on our revenue share payroll. And so what they did was they artificially overinflated the market for athletes by probably double. And what's going to end up happening is we're going to be in a big bubble. And next year, all of these athletes are going to come back and they're going to say, hey, wait a second, I got paid $1 million last year, and now you're offering me $500,000. How is that going to work? The reality is it's not going to work, right? Because you have all these agents, you have all these data points, and now they're going to say, hey, wait a second, I was paid this last year. Why am I not going to be paid this moving forward? And the other piece that I would want people to think about here is that we don't know what's going to happen in the collective bargaining and employment space. But if there ever is a collective bargaining agreement, which will likely happen, and they have to think about what the base compensation is going to be for all these athletes, do you think they're going to go work off of what the $20.5 million cap was? Or do you think they're going to go say, hey, wait a second, it wasn't really $20.5 million. It was probably closer to $30 million because all of you decided to go backload all of your contracts, or front load all the collective contracts, and then sign all of these revenue share contracts thereafter. So it was a very short-sighted decision. That decision, I can guarantee you, was probably not made by the administrators or the ADs. It was probably made by the coaching staffs. And that's essentially what happens. When you leave it into the hands of your coaches, of course they're going to spend as much money as they can. They're not thinking about budgeting. I have $30 million, I'm going to go spend $30 million.
So, Chris, this landscape continues to evolve. We just last week had President Trump issue the executive order titled Saving College Sports, which purports to set forth the administration's views regarding the NIL issues facing college athletics. We've also heard a lot about the SCORE Act, which is a bill that's making its way through the House of Representatives now, which is purporting to set a federal standard for NIL rules and preempt the patchwork of state laws that exist. And so my question for you is, as someone sitting in your chair as the athletic director, how are you managing this ever evolving law landscape, the House settlement, the NCAA rules, the state rules, the international rules, and then potentially the federal rules?
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I would say balancing state level compliance with the potential federal oversight, such as the proposed SCORE Act that you referenced, is probably arguably one of the most complex challenges that right now is facing athletic departments today. We're essentially navigating, as you said, a patchwork of state laws that vary widely in their permissiveness, disclosure requirements, and institutional involvement rules. Our strategy at RMU, and one I've discussed with many of our colleagues, is we prioritize adherence to probably the most stringent existing regulations, whether they originate at the state level, whether it's from the NCAA or from these evolving court rulings. I think this approach, while it's more restrictive in some cases, helps mitigate risk in a highly uncertain legal environment. So we have continued to closely monitor this federal legislative developments. In fact, we just got a email this morning from the NCAA with an update on the SCORES Act. We're actively engaging our legal counsel, specializing in sports law, and we participate in a lot of the industry groups, whether it's through NACDA, through our conference staff colleagues, or our commissioner, to anticipate any potential changes and advocate for a unified federal framework. I do believe a national standard would significantly reduce the compliance burden on institutions. And as an AD, my hope is that the legislation provides clear guidelines, preempts the conflicting state laws, and it does offer those liability protections for institutions that act in good faith. I continue to stress proactive and continuous education for our athletes, for our coaches, for our staff, and all the applicable regulations, which include, of course, for us, the state of Pennsylvania, the NCAA, and those potential federal mandates. And it's absolutely critical that we minimize the compliance risk and we ensure everyone understands this new, evolving, and adapting landscape.
I want to yank in Doug and Jake real quick because, when Jason was discussing kind of the progression here, I heard the word cap, right? And, and all of our other lives, somewhat we've dealt with cap, right? So in the NFL, there's a salary cap. In the NBA, there's a salary cap, and there's a rev share limit here, which serves as a cap for the colleges and universities. But again, a soft cap because you have the third party collective. So this is for Doug and Jake in no particular order. How are you advising, the collectives and or the colleges and universities on navigating a new era where you have a cap?
Well, I'll jump in. The way we look at it and the way I'm advising is what you have to think of what your cap is. Is it 20.5? Is it 19.5? Whatever it is, then you start really formulating a plan of how to distribute that money. And then we look at it by position, and then you talk to the coach and say, in your scheme, give me a de-escalating list of your most important positions down to your least important. And then let's start thinking about a percentage that we're going to assign to each of those positions. Obviously, it's going to be fluid every year and you're going to make some adjustments, but this will be a baseline of it. In the end, though, like it's been said, there's been a hard cap. Now it's a soft cap. But in the end, it's the cap of what you have to spend and what your institution is willing to be able to distribute to players and college athletes.
Yeah, I would say that there's from top down, there's a list of decisions that need to be made before it gets to the coach or the team level. I obviously work specifically at team levels to put some process in place and make sure they make good decisions with what's allotted to them. But the decision that I've seen at a lot of the bigger schools that want to be in this conversation as things evolve, new TV deals, potentially, super leagues and all these types of things, is there's no financial sense to spend what it takes right now to be a top 20 team. They're not going to get a return on that in the short term. These decisions there's a level of deficit spending that's occurring because it is a bit of an arms race. And so the decision in the big picture is, where do we want to be nationally? Where do we want to be in 5 years from now? And where are we going to get the capital to spend to do it. I think that's a big part of the process right now, is figuring out where to get that money. Schools are repurposing all kinds of funds from academics. They're coming up with ways to clean money in some respects, to divert it from other sources. And then obviously once you get to the actual team, they have a process in place to put, the best squad on the field or court or whatever. But it is a very complex situation because of all that. There is just not a super clear allocation of funds and distribution.
And
So-
I just want to jump in as well, and just to piggyback off that, what each institution and athletic department, but mainly presidents and board of trustees, have to decide is how competitive do they want to be? Because there is a dollar figure for that competitiveness. And that dollar figure has to be in commiserate of how you judge your coaches. So if you're only going to give your coach at that sport 50% of what is maximum allowed, then you shouldn't judge them on the max allowed. It should be 50% of what the max allowed is. And that's where it's going to get very interesting and really complicated when you talk about how you hold coaches accountable. So if I'm in a Power 4 school in the ACC and they spend, let's say, 10 million of that 20.5, but Ohio State spends 15 to 18 million, then that coach shouldn't be judged against Ohio State. He should be judged, or she should be judged, against commiserate colleges that put out about the same number of financial commitments. So those are those things that institutions are really going to have to look inward and decide in the end, where do we want to be in this college landscape of sports? And also the coaches have to beat the table and say, wherever we are, judge me on that, not from the highest standard.
So I want to jump in a little bit on disclosure because, and making all of these decisions, data is critical, right? So, in the professional sports world, you have access to contracts, access to, cap space, who's spending what. And in the college world right now, that's not accessible, right? We have, NIL Go, the College Sports Commission, that wants to aggregate some data, to what use we're not quite sure how that will be disseminated. But you also have some states I read recently that are striking disclosure laws, right? Meaning that they're not going to require their student athletes to have to disclose these types of deals. How are you guys dealing with that? And I'll start with you first, Jason. How do you see that unfolding? Because as Nick's negotiated deals with college universities. We tend to have an advantage because we know what different college universities are paying different players at the same position, whereas the college coaches and the teams within aren't privy to that information.
Yeah, so there is to your last point, there is a tremendous vacuum of information that is occurring, and that is one of the reasons why the market is the way the market is. Just as an example, and I released data 2 years ago, but the data this past transfer portal for basketball was very similar. Essentially, if you look at the top 500 ranked basketball transfers in the portal this past spring, first and foremost, if you look at the top 200, I believe 90 or 190 of them went to Power 4 schools. So the lower tier schools, G6, FCS, were non-competitive in getting them. More substantially, if you look at the entire list of athletes, the P4 was paying between 5 to 7 times the amount of money for similarly ranked athletes than the rest of college sports. So as an example, we'll just use Robert Morris. If Robert Morris was going to go get player ranked 325 and spend $50,000 on him, a school like Pittsburgh would turn around and spend $350,000 for a similarly ranked player. And the reason behind that is two. One, there is no data and information. And secondly, the schools, the P4 schools, obviously have bigger budgets. So their coaches are throwing around bigger numbers. And most of them have not created a system and a process to determine what is a player's true value. How they manage that process is literally what Jake does day to day with schools. And so they're just throwing around numbers from that perspective. As it relates specifically to the disclosures, there are some schools, majority of schools right now are pretty by the book in the way that they're going about doing things. And it's important for people that are listening to understand as well. If it's a revenue share contract, it does not need to be disclosed. If it's revenue share, you can pay a kid whatever you want. It doesn't matter. As soon as it's not revenue share and it's true NIL, even though the deliverables are the same, which is complete nonsense, it just doesn't make sense. That contract has to go through the NIL Go platform. And what we have seen, at least initially, is because of the fact that the NIL Go was taking so long to process these contracts, and it was becoming very evident that they weren't going through, a lot of collectives and third-party operators are just like, we're not even going to submit it, because it's impossible at the end of the day for the NCAA or CSC to know who's under what contract, right? So I'll give you a great example. And anybody that's on this call right now can correct me if I'm wrong. Look at international student athletes. There is no real technical way to pay these athletes. Some schools are using licensing agreements. Some are not using licensing agreements. We found a way to do it in the way that we would sign an athlete, leverage their name, image, and likeness to promote the university or brands in their home country through passive NIL agreements. But the reality is that, as far as I know, there's probably over 100 plus schools, if not more, just to my knowledge, that are not using revenue share to pay their international athletes. They're still running those agreements through third-party entities, collectives, operators like Blueprint. And if that contract was put in the NIL Go system, it's almost guaranteed that it would get denied. And yet CSC and Department of Homeland Security and everyone else is sort of turning a blind eye to it because nobody has a solution. So it's really difficult, at least, to reconcile the fact that we're going to play this game of, hey, there's these rules and we have to follow them, but we're going to make all of these different exceptions because we realize that there's individual state laws, there's obviously federal laws, and all of this is still a mess.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I think I can chime in a little bit on the international side. I've been spending quite a bit of time on the last couple weeks trying to figure out how to pay these international athletes. And NIL, I think, is incredibly complicated for our international athletes because of their visa restrictions, especially the F1 student visa. Here's the problem. An FY1 visa generally limits what kind of jobs international students can have and how much money they can earn while they're in the United States. It's actually restricted supposedly to on-campus jobs or specific work related to their studies. NIL activities, whether they're paid for social media posts, endorsements, appearances, often fall outside of what their visa allows. This means international student athletes face huge limitations on what kind of NIL deals they can pursue, if any at all. It really creates a significant unfairness compared to their domestic teammates. And for example, an international star, basketball player, very popular on campus, might not be able to sign a deal with a local car dealership or a national clothing brand for direct payment without potentially putting their visa status at risk. It's just not a hypothetical problem. It's a real challenge, for our international students who see their American teammates making money from NIL, and well, they're restricted. And it's comes down to being a fundamental fairness issue. It affects our ability to recruit top international talent because NIL opportunities are now part of their decision-making process. And every institution is treating it different. Some are paying internationals through revenue share in-house. Some are working on looking at other types of visas. And so right now there are very few clear ways for international athletes to get into NIL without risking their visa status. And we really need some solutions in the collegiate industry. We need clarity from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. We need them to provide clear and detailed rules about how NIL activities are viewed under these current visa rules. One of the new things that we've been doing at RMU, including working with Dinsmore, is looking at a new visa category. The strongest solution would be for Congress to create a new type of visa, I would think, or a specific part of an existing visa, like the P visa for entertainers and artists, that explicitly allows our college athletes to earn the NIL income. And so I would like to see them change the actual F1 visa rules to specifically permit the NIL activities under certain conditions. And it's no different than, President Trump stepping in with the SCORES Act. Right now, maybe there is a new visa that perhaps it has a limit to it, or there's specific reporting requirements. And so I think without these changes, international athletes could continue to be at a major disadvantage, missing out on different opportunities, risking their ability to stay in the United States. And I think this is an area where colleges, athletic conferences, and national governing bodies need to work together really to push for reform.
Well, I think it's worth noting that there's been an uptick in international student participation in collegiate athletics based on NIL, right? Because in the past, if you were a basketball player, you get more money playing for your club overseas. Now the dollars, and Chris, it impacted you, I think, directly. You had a couple international players that go, from Robert Morris to other Division I programs, or the amount of money they're getting paid is incredible. So, volleyball players, hockey players, wherever, you're seeing an uptick. And we at Dinsmore, we very fortunate, we have an immigration department here. And I'll give her a shout out. Katie Jacob has worked with me on some of our NIL agreements and advising on immigration issues, because you got to be really careful to make sure that you're not running afoul of any laws and forcing a student athlete to potentially lose their F1 visa status. Nick?
So, Chris, one of the things that you've touched on a little bit, and then this jumps ahead in our programming slightly, is the seeming need for almost more regulation, if you will, or more guidance or centralized guidance. And my question for you is, who do you believe is best suited to serve in that role? Is it a third party like a Deloitte? Is it this new non-NCAA led college sports commission? Is it the old enforcement and infractions model in the NCAA that exists in the NCAA today? Or is it, some hybrid that's comprised of different stakeholders, including potentially student athletes, including potentially collectives, including potentially the federal government?
Yeah, and, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in this area, but I think, regarding which entity might be best to manage this, I think there are at least three viable options. I think the NCAA is the first viable option. They are the main governing body. They could expand their current clearinghouse idea to become the central place for all NIL information. This would require a big investment in technology and staff, but they already have the existing structure. I think another viable option would be, as you said, a new independent third-party group. We could create a completely new nonprofit organization specifically designed to manage the NIL disclosures. The group, I think, would need to be fair, need to be trusted by both colleges and also the student athletes, similar to how independent groups manage data in the professional sports. I think the other option could be, of course, as you said, the federal government. If a federal law like the SCORE Act does pass, it could require a central federal database, possibly managed by an existing governmental agency or a new one created for this purpose. But I think the key, no matter who manages it, is to have one simple, clear, and easy to use system that helps both the athletes by making reporting easy for them, and then for the college by providing clear, consistent data and reducing our workload. The system probably needs to be strong enough to handle a multitude of transactions and secure enough to protect sensitive athlete information.
So are we saying collective bargaining is the answer? I mean, Jason, Doug, Jake, Doug and Jake, you've worked under a CBA. Jason, you're on the other side. I mean, are we headed there?
Well, the thing I look at it is you really have to, because we're talking about hard cap, soft cap, enforcement. But what's the penalty? If Ohio State goes out there and spends $40 million, what's the penalty? Are they not going to be able to play in the NCAA? NCAA has no ability to enforce any of these so-called rules. So the only way you're going to have an enforcement and really just disclosure of all relevant material and evidence of payment is to have a collective bargaining, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that the enforcement has to be at the conference level to some degree. I think the NCAA's teeth are limited here in terms of team spend. The threat of student eligibility is out there, but there's fair question what actually exists in terms of the NCAA at this point from a compliance standpoint, or whether it's more of event promotions company to some degree now. But I think collective bargaining is necessary. I think it's inevitable. To what extent, I think the fact that student athletes are employees to a degree and they're going to bargain and have certain rights and they will have benefits and things that come with that. But there needs to be a standardization of a lot of these rules that right now are just incredibly debatable, vague, and otherwise. I think with the influx of capital that is bound to occur here, and I think we're supposed to touch on that later, whether it's private equity, where the sources of all the external capital are, I think we wind up in different structures that are more amenable to collective bargaining and to some different types of ways to proceed that maybe seem difficult to comprehend now.
And I guess what I would ask then, so for Chris, does this help you as an AD of a mid-major, right? You're in a tough position, and I've heard this from P4 individuals in P4 athletic departments and said, look, we got our 20.5, but we also have our third-party collective. So we are always going to be that far ahead of the game because we could always offer more, through collective deals to entice student athletes. Would collective bargaining do anything to balance out the playing field, or are mid majors, low majors always going to be playing catch up to the P4s?
I mean, mid-major and low major Division I schools are always going to be playing catch up. The amount of money that's driven between the media rights and the other types of revenue streams at the Power Four schools, it's just tremendous amount more than what we can generate. And so, at the end of the day, I have done little to no research on collective bargaining. I'll leave that for the P4 institutions to go down that route. To be honest with you, what we do at the mid-major, low major Division I level is we focus in on those revenue sports, and in particular, it's going to be football or basketball. Some schools might be a little bit different with hockey or maybe baseball. But we have to, up and beyond what we bring in revenue, we have to raise a lot of money that supplements, of course, this rev share for us to be able to be, successful. Like in the Horizon League, as an example, we've fortunate to have incredible corporate sponsors and incredible donor base that's allowed us to secure funds. It puts us up there, whether it's number one or number two for the sports of men's and women's basketball. And you've seen the competitive success that we had in men's basketball, and we will this upcoming year in women's basketball. Without that revenue, we're not going to be able to bring in the talent. We figured out how to bring in the talent. We just got to figure out how to retain the talent now. That's the next big obstacle for us. So I don't think anybody in the mid-major or low major even has discussions about even competing in the P4 world. I think the one conference that would be the Big East Conference with men's and women's basketball. But other than that, we stay in our lane, and we want to be competitive against those that we're competing against in our own conferences.
Jason, to pivot a little bit, Jake just mentioned the concept of private equity and funding for third-party collectives. Can you talk a little bit about the potential pros and cons of private equity investments as opposed to sort of the traditional governance model in college sports, and whether you've seen any of that and where you see the future of that?
Yeah, so that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room that nobody is talking about, but is going to be talked about quite a bit very soon. The reality is that private equity is coming. There are already deals that have sort of been done. Most of those deals, the early ones we heard about, Penn State and UCLA, would elevate. Those are really built around debt and credit. So for those that don't know how private equity works, there's kind of three different routes, but we'll really categorize it as two. One primarily is debt or credit, which means a private equity firm comes to a business, let's say this college athletics department says, we are going to loan you $100 million. That is going to be basically a mortgage. It's going to be at a substantially high interest rate, probably somewhere in the area of 15 to 18%, meaning that at the end of a term, usually 8 to 10 years, that entity has to pay back that money plus 2x, right? So we give you 100, we're going to get a $200 million exit in 10 years. The reason why somebody might do that is they don't have access to other capital that they need to be able to drive new revenue. The reality, though, is that for most schools, you can issue bonds as long as you have a decent credit rating at much lower percentage, at 4%, not 15 or 18%. Some schools, though, we'll use Penn State as an example. Penn State has a lot of financial issues right now. They've closed, I believe, 4 campuses in this past year. And so they were essentially looking for a loan, and they're collateralizing it against their future ticket sales at Beaver Stadium through this Elevate partnership. On the other side, we have yet to see a deal like this, but there's this equity approach, meaning somebody comes in, private equity, sets up a special purpose vehicle with an institution, bifurcates or pulls out their revenue producing assets. So ticket sales, multimedia rights, corporate sponsorships, licensing, NIL, and says, hey, we're going to put a valuation on this business, and then we're going to actually buy a piece of the business moving forward. So in December, I released the first ever rankings around college athletic valuations for CNBC. Ohio State, Texas were 1 and 2, valued at around $1.2, $1.3 billion. So if somebody wanted to go to Ohio State and say, hey, listen, we think you're worth $1 billion, we want to give you $100 million, and we want to take 10% of the business. What that is going to do, and this is happening. I mean, pretty much every institution that's worth anything has already had some sort of conversations in this space, is there's going to be a lot of capital that is going to flow into the industry. And naturally, that capital in many ways is going to be sometimes used highly efficiently to create new revenue. Sometimes it's going to be used highly inefficiently, say, to pay players. It's probably a pretty bad investment to take a loan at a 15 to 18% turnaround and then overpay your student athletes when you don't even know how much market value is for them. But we're going to see that happen because that's just how institutions are going to operate in this space. But what we are likely going to see as more and more capital flows into the industry, there's obviously going to be substantially more commercialization, and that is going to potentially reduce the need for an entity like the NCAA. And ultimately, it is highly likely that we will see a breakaway in some capacity of the Power Four, probably more likely the SEC and the Big Ten, who are going to say, hey, listen, we're worth a combined, as of today, based on the rankings that I created, they're worth a combined $25 billion. You know, by 2030, 2032, when their media rights contracts expire, that's probably going to be closer to at least 30 to 35 billion. It's a very substantial amount of money. And they might say, hey, listen, we don't need you guys anymore. We don't want to play Robert Morris, you know, in football or basketball. We can just play each other and we'll have a lot more value. That is ultimately what is going to happen. So it's my opinion that we need somebody to come in, and for mid-major schools and G6, so less about the Power Four, but even then, if you're an institution right now, you have a $20 million bill that you have to pay for your athletes that you didn't have to do last year. And so those schools outside of, 5 or 6, Ohio State, Texas, Florida, are actually producing revenue. Where are you going to get that money? And more importantly, where are you going to get money to hire new staff, figure out how to drive new revenue? You have to pay this $20 million. And so if you're a mid-major program or a group of 6 program, it's even harder. You can't even pay the full bill to compete for the athletes that you want, much less invest into better coaches, better services for your student athletes. So more than likely, you're going to have to figure out how to take out outside capital. And that's how business works, right? Any big business that's traded on the public stock exchange, any Fortune 500 company at some point took money, right? They took venture capital money, they took private equity money, they eventually went and created an IPO to drive new revenue into the business, to be able to go and grow. So that's the natural evolution of where college sports is. I would be extremely surprised if we're sitting here in 10 years and the majority of Division I institutions that are categorized as Division I institutions today are not sitting on some sort of private capital deal, whether it's debt, credit, or equity. That is the future, and that is where this is all going.
Well, I want to direct this question to Doug and Jake, because I didn't read your entire bios, but you guys both have, some experience in finance or, investment, all that good stuff, which has, helped you along your front office trajectories. And private equity comes sometimes with management restrictions, right? They want to control their dollars, smart dollars. Could private equity influence the competitive balance or athlete welfare? And how are you advising, organizations on how to respond to that? Because it's not just, hey, we gave you the money, you may not have invested it wisely, and that's okay, right? I mean, that's not how private equity works. Any thoughts? Jake, you're shaking your head. Go for it, Jake.
Yeah,
You're shaking your
I've
head.
got a ton of thoughts. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. I think, like everything else, the details and the structure will make the biggest difference. It's not just that they're going to take capital; it's how they take it and what the terms are. I feel like the universities are going to be the reason that this hasn't landed to this point, even though there's been a lot of high profile players in the market who have a lot of capital, and they haven't necessarily gotten schools to take it, is because it's scary, and because the issue of control is a hard one, and because a lot of these are state institutions, and there's all kinds of issues with that. Not that they're impossible. They deal with them in a lot of other areas where universities produce private things that go private. But I think that there will be a structure that works where university maintains control, but this influx of capital gives them even more impetus to professionalize in terms of the business, the management of the business, and the management at the team level, providing better process and structure, more of a defined, ROI, if you will, on what they're spending on players. What I've seen with the schools I've worked with, and just generally being involved, is not great process, lacking key function on like football ops or basketball ops, coaches with not the skill set necessarily doing a lot of the allocating. So I think this winds up being a significant impetus towards pushing towards more professional level management on both sides of it ultimately. And yeah, I think it's inevitable. It's just a matter of what the right structure is that lands and who does it first.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of what Jake says. One, since I work with the UFL, one of our ownership groups is Redbird Capital, which is a private equity. And there is a saying that I was told probably about 5 months ago that I will never forget, and I tell it to everybody. The answer to every question is, it's about the money. You just tell me the question. So private equity understands that in college athletics, there is a tremendous amount of money that is in the pipeline now, and it's only going to get bigger. And as an institution, like Jake says, it's the devil's in the detail. If you are going to take private equity as a partner, how is it structured? And I was advising one institution where the structure was more like a multimedia rights agreement, where they split the revenue after paying all debts and everything like that. So again, it depends on the institution, but where I see it going, and it's already happened, is the University of Kentucky Athletic Department is its own LLC, and they are breaking away from the university so they can entertain any type of money that wants to be thrown their way, be it private equity, be it a minority owner or whatever, and they won't have to be under the restrictions of a university. And I think they are the first, but they will not be the last. And like we all know, private equity will be in, if it's in the NFL, it's coming to the NCAA and universities.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. I think Kentucky was the first kind of tippy toe out in that area, but once you start looking at the optionality you get in some of these other structures and rolling, they rolled the athletic department out, but you will see specific teams rolled out into entities, and then you're able to deal with employees and all kinds of other stuff that you can't currently do. And I think when you lay all these problems out on the table, which is the reason we're all here for an hour and a half, you start to see that some of the solutions become a lot easier in other structures, and inevitably you'll go in that direction. But and part of this is you're seeing people's job responsibilities change, right? I mean, we were talking about athletic directors and school presidents who are now kind of being investment bankers, where they're having to weigh these different offers and capital structures. And that's at the heart of all of this, is just this evolution and changing of what people have done historically versus what they're being asked to do now.
And I'll just jump in as well on that. Last, I think, one or two athletic directors that I've seen be hired, or a few that are being hired, are coming from the corporate world or used to be marketing directors at a major conference, not a major conference, but a major business and or a professional team. So they are looking, that AD role is switching to college, from a college administrator to more of a revenue producer / CEO role.
Yeah, University of Oklahoma is a client of mine, and they brought in an alum who's former CEO of AT&T, Fortune 5 CEO that I have had, wasn't sure how it would impact me or what this would be like. But since November, I have worked hand in hand, probably talked to him on almost a daily basis. And I can tell you that the skills he brings to the table as a global CEO are incredibly valuable in the issues that are afoot right now in college athletics. And so that you're going to see, like, having those tools in the toolbox right there, very, very valuable for the institution. And I've seen it firsthand.
Have you also seen that evolve with the GM roles? Because I know at its inception, when we were dealing with collectives, a lot of times, and it's not a knock on anyone, it was former athletes, somebody familiar with the university or had a tie there, right? I guess because part of that's fundraising, and part of it's knowing the individuals within the institution. But that has become more of a business role, and you can see it divided up by organization, right? So you have some schools who have like a GM that's business minded, one that's personnel minded, or if you have a Jake Rosenberg, you're both, right? You got the personnel side, the business side. Structure wise, this is for Jason, Chris, Doug. What are you guys seeing now? Where's the evolution going on how the business is run, even on the collective side?
Yeah, so I'll just start on the collective side. The majority of schools decided that they were going to close down their collectives prior to knowing that there was going to be a soft cap. So some of them obviously are still in operation. The majority of those are at the high major level. There are a lot of schools that are still using their collective. So NIL is now merged into Blueprint Sports. Blueprint Sports is now operating as essentially a back office for many of these institutions to manage their revenue share agreements and work with the athletes from that perspective. So that in and of itself is a sign that many of these schools realize this is a very sophisticated process and they need outside help to be able to manage that. There has also been a rush, it's the new thing, to be able to go hire general managers and all these other individuals to come in and manage your payroll and your salary cap and whatever else. That being said, many of these general managers don't actually know or have experience working with salary caps. They've taken their operations guy or whoever else and they brought them in. We have seen Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say there are some schools that have hired people from the NFL and the NBA, but the vast majority of them are still trying to figure out how to even navigate all of this. They're going and they're signing up with third-party service providers like Teamworks, General Manager Tool, and Dropback, and all of these other things. But they actually haven't created the processes and the procedures that they need to be able to make really good decisions, which is exactly what Jake does when he sits down with institutions, says, how do we actually turn what was essentially a nonprofit operation into a full-out professionalized front office operation where you can make real decisions on who to recruit, how much to pay them, and how much to optimize your talent.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that what you had was the GM was a very cool, nice title that was a form of currency and allowed certain coaches to pay somebody less but retain them by giving them a title. And now and this has been litigated over and over, the jury's return verdicts time and time again, coaches paying players and dealing with all these things in the NFL. It doesn't work. It's not a viable model. And it's inevitable that in college, whether coaches realize it themselves or are forced to realize it, that they need help, and these are legitimate skill sets. But it's not about just hiring somebody and giving them a title. It's about having a legitimate process, people being in roles that make sense. Scouting is a thing now in college where what has been considered scouting has not really been professional caliber player evaluation. And so all these things come together to form process and reconstitute roles. And I think a GM, I've seen it firsthand, having a strong GM that can bring all these things together. Roster building is an art. It's a combination of a whole bunch of different things, but it's a lot. It's a full-time job, and coaching is certainly a full-time job. And the reason most of these coaches are making what they are is because they're great coaches and recruiters. It's not their negotiation and salary cap managing skills. So that I've sort of made a big bet on it. I burned all my boats. Not that it's the only part of what I'm doing, but I believe in it wholeheartedly. And I think the schools that take it seriously, it'll take a while to see the results of legitimate player evaluation and good process, but I think they have a distinct advantage.
And just like the AD role has changed and morphed into what it is now, so is the college head coaching position. And it's not recruiting, it's retention, it's transfer portal, and it's asset allocation. And in the end, return on investment. And those are skill sets that these college coaches never had to think about, don't have a depth of knowledge about. And that's why you're going to see the programs that get it, or the coaches that understand they don't have it, bringing in quality people like GMs and setting up their departments to mimic a professional entity.
Right. And like Doug said, it's all about the money. Just tell me what the question is or whatever. In this particular case, whether you're spending school money or you're spending booster in, donor money, at some point, while it was fun for a lot of them to spend money and feel like quasi GMs or fantasy football, it does come down to, well, where's my return? You can't just burn money and think that people are going to continue to give. And so what I've seen firsthand, honestly, at some of the schools is, hey, we're working with Jake. They have a process. There's NFL experience. There's all this stuff to put a process in, and boosters and people are like, cool, I'll write checks if I know that there's a legitimate process. But if it's just what has gone on at a lot of schools previously, it's hard for them to justify that. They're business people and they need returns.
Chris, were you going to chime in? I saw you come off for a second.
Yeah, I'm going to make this really easy from an athletic director's perspective. If I'm going to pay somebody to P4 school $400,000, $500,000, $850,000, or $1.25 million of some of the salaries I've seen, I'm going to hire an expert. I'm going to hire someone who has a business financial acumen, someone that knows what they're doing in that general manager role, which is exactly what Jake talked about, what Doug talked about, and what Jason talked about. Head coaches, we're at a different, age in our industry now. They got to really kind of tunnel vision it on coaching, and the scouting, the GM part of it it's totally different now. And those are things, that's why you're paying them, those individuals, that kind of money, because of their expertise that really isn't in the collegiate athletics industry right now. And so you're having to draw from the professional leagues to be able to, really kind of elevate, your program and be able to continue to, move your program in that right direction. So to me, it's pretty easy. With those salaries, that are out there, you're just not going to hire the regular operations person, or the person in compliance, or the person who's in the fundraising office, or the person who's in the marketing office, like I've seen a lot of schools do. You're going to hire someone who's in, actually knows what they're doing in the industry.
Chris, as a follow-up to that commentary you just had, we've seen a lot of instances in the last couple of years where student athletes, particularly in basketball and football, who may have gone to the pros prior to their eligibility expiring, are making the decision to stay in college and to use up all of their eligibility because there's a financial incentive for them to do so. I see Coach Scully's on the phone. We've seen in the last month or so here, kids who are playing major junior hockey in Canada now coming and playing Division I men's hockey at Penn State and Michigan State. as an athletic director, how do you deal with the increasing star profile of these student athletes on campus? For example, Penn State has the consensus #1 overall draft pick in the NHL on campus this year. Is that something that you're now having to factor into your coaching decisions, the ability to manage these student athletes who in some circumstances are being paid more than the coaches and other administrators on campus?
Yeah, I think NIL, it's definitely changing how college athletes, as you talked about, when they decide to turn pro, and there's a couple different paths that they can take. There's additional incentives now to stay, or making the jump to the pros is less financially urgent. When you're looking at the example, like you said, with Penn State, they paid their. Trust me, I golf with Coach Schooley every Wednesday late afternoon, and so I've heard about it the last 2 weeks about the $700,000 player to $1.2 million player. I think that you're bringing in a different athlete at the P4 level that are making the kind of money they're making, the investment that you're putting into them. But again, they still have to go to school. They still have to graduate. It is our responsibility as athletic directors and/or those senior administrators that work directly with those athletes to make sure that we're providing them the education, the programming, so make sure they understand their brand management, make sure they understand financial literacy, make sure they understand taxation. There's a lot more investment than just what they're getting paid in their NIL or their revenue share. We're investing in them, we're investing in their career, we're investing in their futures. And the coaches have a big part in that today. I could talk an entire session about, the new generations and dealing with Generation Z. It's a different athlete today. Coaches have to coach differently today. It's just, again, when you're talking about, you can recruit them, but you got to retain them. Part of it is the money, and part of it is, how they're treating the student athlete experience they have. The student athlete welfare and well-being is a huge issue as well. We got to provide all the, sports medicine, strength conditioning, nutrition, all the top amenities that athletes expect now. And again, they know what's being given at other schools as well. So it's a hard job to be a head coach today with this generation because, again, first thing that, the head coach are hearing is, what is my NIL? It's no longer about facilities. It's no longer, about the academics at the school. It's about how much money they can get.
But and I think a good segue, and we want to talk a little bit about the pro pathways as it relates to NIL. Nick and I, we deal with student athletes, right? Where a lot of times as attorneys, we're on that side negotiating with the NIL collective or now the universities on rev share. And the one difficult transition I think for the collegiate athlete has been, you're going to be treated like a pro athlete, right? So, we may give you that number this year. If you underperform, you may not get that number next year, right? Because the majority of the deals that we're seeing, and I know some universities are trying to implement 2-year deals, but a lot of the deals you see are 1-year deals. So you got to go back to the table the next year to negotiate the next deal. I guess this is for the entire panel, but particularly Doug and Jake. How do you see that impacting that trajectory that it used to be? If I could get out after 3 years, I'm getting out. If I could get out, after 1 year removed from high school for basketball, I'm going to the league. You're not seeing that as much anymore. You're seeing guys 6 years if they can get it. 5 years.
Yeah.
Where is this headed, and how do the leagues affect that?
I mean, yeah, Doug, you want to start?
No, go ahead, Jake.
Okay, I was just gonna say. I think broadly, there is a trend towards player empowerment across professional leagues, and I think that what we have done here in college sports is, I have this conversation a lot in terms of mindsets in college. It is turned into your players are not there for 3 or 4 years. You don't necessarily have a whole lot of leverage over them staying. And so the way in the pros, it's explicit in terms of you have to treat them well. They are clients. You have to communicate with them. They're representatives. And I think that is now the case in college where players are clients as much as anything else. So you need to think about a lot of things that have never been thought of before in terms of things that you offer them, personal development programs, those types of things, and then communicating with their representatives and catering to them. But you're right. The other side of the coin, it's nothing comes for free. And for college athletes, you are paid a certain thing, or you are brought there under the guise of a specific role. And if you don't meet that expectation, it's not like your scholarship, that could either be reduced or removed entirely. And so there is a quid pro quo, I guess. And that's a tough adjustment. But that's what you get, commensurate with being paid and treated, and having free agency every year, is you need to be at least at the level or role that you're expected to, or outperform. Otherwise, that's everything. It's a performance business, and now it's the case with college athletes too.
Yeah, I agree. It's as they say, rent's due every day now that you're getting paid, and to whom much is given, much is expected. But on the flip side of that, like you said, Eddie, there are student athletes that, and when this first got NIL first kicked in, I was not advising a collective, but I was just talking to a couple agents, and this agent reached out to me and says, "This guy is my client is rated as a fifth rounder, but the college is guaranteeing him 500,000." I said, "Well, stay in school, because as a fifth rounder, you are not guaranteed to make that team. And all he can do is not only guarantee, he's got the guaranteed 500, but if he comes back and improves, he might improve his draft stock." So that's one of the positive unintended consequences of NIL. But in the end, it comes down to they have to produce. And if they don't produce, and it's a life lesson that these players, college athletes, are learning earlier and earlier in life, where most of them wouldn't have learned it until they graduated or got drafted or tried to go into the next level of their sport. Now it's as soon as you get into college, if you want to get if you are offered NIL, you have to perform to keep that NIL deal. So it's a professional way of looking at it, but it's making these student athletes grow up real quick and get real world advice and real world consequences to their actions.
But when you're seeing that, and Jason, you can jump in, you're seeing that now reflected in the rev share contracts between a university or a member institution and student athlete, right? In some of the deals we were seeing previously, you could get a 10-month term, right? You could, so you could line your collective agreement up with the portal opening up, so the student athlete would have the ability to transfer freely. Now you're starting to see language in there, and I just saw a note on buyout, and Jake, thanks for addressing that. But you're starting to see schools proffer buyout language and have some type of penalty structured into the contract, so that if the student athlete chooses to leave early, there's some type of forfeiture. There are now penalties that are included in some of these contracts, et cetera. Where are you seeing the trends? Because this is where we make our money, right? Student athlete comes to Eddie and Nick, we're going to recognize all of this, and our markup's coming back pretty bad. But I read a statistic, and I can't state what it was, and Jason, you could correct me on this. Is it 75% or so of student athletes don't have adequate representation? I mean, you're not hiring or agents.
Adequate is the key word.
To go and represent them here. But I mean, again, I'm seeing it. I saw an agreement probably a week ago, and I couldn't believe it. And fortunately we have some very good IP attorneys here who work with us. And even with the exploitation of the IP right, retaining that right, it not being in perpetuity, and all that good stuff, we were able to claw back on some of the language. But again, Jason, I'll start with you. What are you seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah, so a couple of different things. To your statistic, we did an internal study, and we basically looked at all of the representatives that were representing student athletes that we were negotiating with, and 80% of them were not registered within the state under the Uniform Athlete Agent Act to represent those student athletes at that institution. So call it adequate or not, I mean, the vast majority of kids either don't have representation, they're being represented by their cousin, uncle, AAU coach, whoever. Very few of them have an actual lawyer or real licensed professional agent that's actually doing something with them. The concept of the buyout is not necessarily, it's becoming more and more common, and it will be, I think, ubiquitous very quickly. That being said, pretty much all of the contracts that we had structured over the last couple of years essentially had an ability to get an out if the student athlete entered the transfer portal. And schools are not stupid. They want to make sure that a kid is actually going to see themselves through the process, through the season. We saw that particularly in football. We also structure the contract so that the majority of the money comes in after transfer portal periods, so that if an athlete does leave, there's some mitigation that's incurred from that perspective. But buyouts are necessary, and particular buyouts are going to be necessarily at the mid-major level, because if Robert Morris identifies a kid that they're going to develop and build, and all of a sudden that kid is now a high major quality student athlete, they should be getting compensated for that. The example that I've used in the past, we worked with Indiana State University 2 years ago. They had a great basketball team. That team went 32-7, almost won the NIT. They won the conference. They were ranked in the top 25. We deployed $78,000 total in NIL for those players. The top 5 kids transferred. 2 went to Texas, 2 went to St. Louis with Coach Schertz, 1 went to Xavier. Those 5 student athletes signed over $2 million in contracts last year. So imagine if they had a 10 or 20% buyout on their deal. That could have been several hundreds of thousands of dollars of new revenue that went back into Indiana State's coffers. That should be happening. I mean, that's what happens in professional sports. If somebody leaves, you're trading, you're getting a pick, you're getting, cash compensation. There's no reason that doesn't exist. The reality, though, is that until somebody comes in and builds out that structure, collective bargaining would do that, a commercialized roll-up or some sort of entity that manages that process. But it's pretty clear that there needs to be some more structure here. Otherwise, athletes are going to do whatever they want, and schools are going to have to pay. And that is not a sustainable business model for anybody here.
And Jason, that flips back right to the rev share number. So technically, if a university pays that buyout to another university, that number goes back to that university in their coffer. But isn't that meant to hit back on the rev share number?
Yeah, it counts against the cap. Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the short answer is does count against the cap, but that's no different than somebody, in the NFL moving teams, and the other team has to pay the cap hit. They're going to get hit, right? They got to pay out their contract, whatever that may be. That being said, we do see how European soccer works. It's not novel. There are transfer fees, and that's a system that's worked and that will have some sort of realization. I would have to think that eventually it will be renegotiated in some sort of capacity to maybe not hit against the cap, because we're just talking about potentially more money into the system. And I think it would be a lot easier if we figured it out. But again, we need collective bargaining to make that happen.
So we're approaching the end of our time here. I'm sure, like most of you guys, anytime that someone who's interested in sports finds out that as part of my job, I deal with the NCAA, the inevitable question is, what's going to happen to the NCAA? So we have a little category here called bold predictions. Doug, we'll start with you. What's your bold prediction for what's going to happen in the NIL space over the next 5 years?
I would say within the next 5 years, or definitely before the new media rights deals negotiated, there will be a super conference. Those super conference will be made up between 30 and probably 60 teams. And all those there'll be teams, there'll be actually, like the University of Kentucky, entities that break away and probably pay a rights fee to the university to wave their flag, but they will be their own entity. And that's why the players will be considered employees, and you'll have a collective bargaining agreement and a CBA. So I think within the next 5 years, that will be the case where NCAA will deal with the mid-majors, the Power Six, but this super conference, every team will be its own LLC, have a CEO, have a marketing revenue CRO, marketing person, and a professional just build out of the whole entity. And that's where it's going. And I think it's going to be sooner than later.
Jake, what do you got?
Bold prediction. I feel like I called the NCAA just a promotional company before. So that was a bit of a bold prediction. I mean, I agree with elements of what Doug said. I mean, I think that of the schools that are trying to be part of the biggest conversation and, that would be considered a super league, I don't believe it's a super league. I still think the conference structure survives, because I think a lot of these private equity initiatives are going to be done at the conference level, and that will fortify the conferences as we know it. But I think just about every school in Big Ten, SEC at least, will have non-institutional capital as part of its operating budget in the next 5 years, point blank period. I think that the levels of spending that are required right now for these athletic departments are not available to them currently, but there is some perceived pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that will inspire them to take on the capital and continue to spend at levels that are unsustainable, at least in their current budgets.
Jason?
Yeah, I agree with both Doug and Jake. I mean, I think both is going to happen. Collective bargaining will happen. It doesn't mean that there will be employment. The reality is that that's going to be a government decision. And with the current administration, I know that they obviously do not want employment, and that is a slippery slope. What Jake said is also true. Technically, you don't need a super league. What we will see is a pseudo super league at the minimum, meaning the SEC and the Big Ten will decide, hey, maybe we don't need to break off from the NCAA, because essentially the college football playoff is its own entity. But we are just going to play each other instead of playing, Bowling Green and Robert Morris. And so essentially what you will have is the best teams playing each other week in, week out. And that is going to create a lot of challenges for the lower end of the schools, the FCS, because Robert Morris relies heavily on guarantee games to fund its basketball and football program. Most schools do. So right now, the schools that should be really worried are the schools, the bottom 250 schools that rely heavily on those leagues to be able to subsidize their athletic departments. They got to figure out very quickly how they can get to break even without being reliant on these big institutions to drive new revenue.
I'm going to jump in before Chris answers. Do you see a lot? I mean, you saw it happen at St. Francis, right? You make the NCAA tournament, and then now you're Division III, right? You've reduced, relinquished your Division I status. And Chris, Chase, do you guys see more institutions heading that route just because of the competitive arms race? They just won't be able to sustain it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think the lower end of Division I, that will happen. I mean, you look at St. Francis NEC schools, they are, like New Haven announced that they're going Division I. I just don't understand it. Like, what is the value proposition that is going to be created that's going to drive, like, playing in the NEC conference? Like, now you're going to be able to go play Duke once in a while and get your butt kicked. Like, great, but I don't think that there's a very strong value proposition. So the reality is that, yes, many schools are going, I don't say many, but the bottom of the tier is probably going to fall off. I think you'll see a lot of other schools that'll start going to non-scholarship. I think you will see FBS schools that are struggling financially and are not winning that say, why are we doing this? Let's just go to non-scholarship football. And now we can get 100 kids to pay full tuition and we'll make money off the program instead of losing it all the time. That is the reality of the situation that is going to occur. And we will see more and more of that as time goes by.
Hey, Chris, before I ask you for your bold prediction, maybe as part of your response, could you address the idea that Jason's been talking about with maybe certain conferences breaking away, with perhaps maybe certain programs within schools in those conferences breaking away, and some of the non-revenue sports not breaking away and maybe playing a more localized schedule? For example, one of the things that's been talked a lot about with the expansion of the Big Ten are the non-revenue sports that are having to fly to the West Coast for, gymnastics meets or golf meets. And not to pick on those sports, but those are, traditionally non-revenue sports that are having to travel across the country. Do you see a future in which those athletic programs are breaking away or separating themselves from some of the footballs and the basketballs and some of the revenue generating sports at the P4 schools and playing a more localized schedule that would, maybe inure to your benefit at Robert Morris?
Well, I can tell you this, pre-COVID, I don't know if there's any athletic directors would have predicted we're in the situation we're in right now. And I think with evolution and adaptation, we've had to be very nimble and agile. So I do think there is something coming. What that is, I'm not real sure. But I do think that for low mid majors or mid majors or the group of 5 or 6 or whichever however is determined. They've got to be pretty bold. They got to be really creative and innovative if they don't want to be left behind. And so I do think you'll probably see some private equity, as Jason talked about. He is probably one of the premier guys with knowledge with private equity that will make its way into the mid-major level. And I think that you'll probably see a split, definitely with those P4 institutions. I mean, I worked at Alabama for 7.5 years, and I can tell you one of the things I used to always say was, we used to solve problems by writing checks at Alabama, and everywhere else you got to solve the problem by solving the problem, right? And so that's what we're doing right now. We're trying to solve a problem that probably isn't going to be solved. We're never going to catch up to the P4. So I think at some point you will see a split there. It just determines, there's a lot more to splitting than what the public knows. Particularly with the CFP. Again, a lot of like football is underwritten by the NCAA, and all the revenues go to the CFP, and all the expense goes to the NCAA, and a lot of that's covered by the NCAA basketball tournament. So someone a lot smarter than me is going to have to figure out what that framework looks like down the road. But collectively, I do think that we're going to see some massive change, and some people think it's 8 to 10 years. I think it'll be much sooner than that.
Well, Chris, you just hit something real quick, and I just want to throw it out. I mean, we talked about football, we talked about basketball, which includes men's and women's. Real quick, future of non-revenue generating / Olympic sports.
I think there's always a place for those. I mean, again, when you're talking about mid-major and low mid-major programs, that's a majority of the NCAA Division I schools. We are the majority, right? And so it is a brand awareness for the school. It is a visibility for the institution. It's also an enrollment component, particularly with this enrollment cliff that's coming all across the country in the next 5 to 7 years. So I don't see Olympic sports being cut, particularly with Title IX. And anytime that you cut a sport, it is a significant stain to the institution, and it tarnishes the institution and the brand awareness and visibility. Again, I think that you may see, as Jason indicated, a lot more Olympic sports going to no scholarship. That could happen relatively in the next few years as well.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time. I want to thank our panel guys.
I didn't get to do my bold prediction yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. Bold prediction.
My bold prediction.
Take us home.
My bold prediction is Jason Belzer will be the CEO and founder of a new governing body, a third-party governing body for college athletics in the next 5 to 8 years. That's my bold prediction.
And Chris will be my deputy.
And he used to be my legal rep, so that's why I say that.
and Dinsmore is going to negotiate the whole deal. So there we go. Well, hey, thank you guys for your time. This was awesome. Obviously, all of our panelists are readily accessible on social media and whatnot. We'll get their information in case anybody wants to reach out to them. Obviously, extremely knowledgeable in this space. Thank you to Nick Godfrey. Again, Nick, extremely knowledgeable as well. Myself, Eddie, if we could ever be of assistance and answer any questions for anybody, feel free to reach out to us. And again, thank you for your time. Enjoy the remainder of your Wednesday. Thanks, everybody.